but and just for the benefit of the recording, we just finished the same presentation by Troy Ramming from ICF that was presented at the advisory committee meeting on the 22nd of September. So with that, we'll open it up for questions. And Ralph, I see your hand's been up for a little bit, so we'll start with you, and then we'll take it from there.
These are questions on the HCP.
It would be great if we could talk about the HCP first, if people have burning questions about that. And I won't hold it too long before we'll go to the other topics, but let's start there.
Have barred owls been found on the Elliott?
Absolutely. Yeah, there are barred owls, unfortunately, up and down the Coast Range.
So what is the strategy to deal with them?
Yeah, it's a great question. So certainly any work done with northern spotted owls has to be done within the context of the presence of barred owls and the pressure that barred owls are putting on northern spotted owls. Within the context of the HCP, we actually decided not to specifically include conservation strategies, focused on barred owls, only because there is an expectation that that will probably be a pretty high priority research objective from OSU in management of the Elliott, and that any barred owl, management or other, I'll just say management generally, which includes a lot of things, including removal probably, would be done through a research context or within a research context. So that's the way DSL and OSU are planning to handle it on the Elliott at this time. But certainly as probably the number one priority for dealing with spotted owls on the Elliott and anywhere else.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ralph. Peggy, you were up next, and then Barry is following you.
Thank you. I have two questions really quickly. One is, what happens if future endangered species show up on the Elliott? Actually, we think there probably already are, but what's the process?
Yeah, great question. So the reason why I mentioned early on that we're addressing 3 species here, so this will result in permits for those 3 species. Any other species that are currently listed or might get listed in the future are not covered by these permits. And so what that effectively means is any work that's happening on the Elliott would have to occur using take avoidance techniques, or at any point in the future, the HCP, there is an amendment process for the HCP, so the HCP can be amended at any point in the future to add new species. So if something is not listed today but gets listed in the future, the first question would be, are the activities going to affect that species? And if the answer is yes, then the next question would be, can it be managed with take avoidance, or should we amend the HCP to add that species? And an amendment process is a little bit easier, but quite similar to the development of the HCP in the first place. So it has to go through, kind of a full, basically open up the permit, go through the whole process, add the new species, and then it would have to go through the NEPA process again.
Thank you. The second question then has to do with the NEPA process. I realize it's not your responsibility. It's, well, sort of as the contractor, but the federal government is really the people who are going to be in charge of this. You have said that you think that you're going to be able to provide this to you're going to hand it off to the federal government later this year or first of next year. Do you have a range of time before the possibility, so I'm giving all the qualifiers, that a decision would be made on the HCP?
Yeah, and let me just say a couple of things. One is, so we're going to send them the next draft of this administrative draft on October 8th. We're hoping that draft is complete enough for them to start the NEPA process yet this year. It may be that they want some additional changes and we make those tweaks and then we start it, but we're hoping the NEPA process gets started this year. The only thing I can say about the timing after that is that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service currently has 2 years to complete the NEPA EIS process. And so it will at least be done within 2 years. In our discussions with them, we all think that it can be done sooner than that. And we've certainly been working with them along the way here. They've been really involved in all of this work. So there's no surprises here from their perspective. But that's about as far as I can go in terms of how they'll handle that. I do know that they are devoted to getting it done, and they know it's a high priority, and I think they've certainly, assigned staff to facilitate the process. So.
Yeah, that's why I gave all the qualifiers. Thank you very much.
And
And
I'll add to Troy's answer that the draft that we're submitting on October 8th, we believe is NEPA ready, and we're comfortable that it is. We know that we've been working right along with them. So as Troy said, there won't be any surprises in it, but there may be some review and some tweaking required. We'll just find out. Barry, you're up. You're on mute,
Barry.
Still on mute.
It was clear to me from last meeting that this project is much more clearly defined as one about money. And I think that what we're doing tonight, and what I've heard from Troy, is that we haven't taken into account the fact that this is so much now driven by finances. And that since this is going to legislation, I want to know if, and money is going to have to be raised, an awful lot of money after the 5th year, as Tom DeLuca pointed out last time. And when I asked the question, how many trees will have to be murdered in that 5th year in order to meet the budget, he wasn't able to answer that question. I don't know how we can have a habitat plan, Troy, with that kind of knowledge, without that kind of information. The second is, I've asked this question several times before, and that is, I never hear mentioned the 3.2 million acres that are going to be reinstated, supposedly, hopefully, and probably through the Biden administration for the northern spotted owl. I assume some of that is going to be in Oregon, and I don't ever hear you or anybody else talk about that and how that gets factored into this habitat plan, which actually bothers me. And the third thing that disturbs me also, and that is the frequent use of the word habitat. And without actually very much description and very much definition of what a habitat actually looks like and how complicated it is and how much we don't understand about that for the northern spotted owl. I know some of it from reading, but I think the notion of habitat is a very complicated one. And I'm, for one, disturbed by the conservation plan and need to have a whole lot more questions answered.
So Barry, maybe I'll take on the first piece. There was modeling done that took the parameters of the research platform that you've seen that's published, I think, from April, but prior versions as well, and looked at the number of acres that were available for different types of harvest and the timing of that, and associated that with different revenue streams that could be expected to be associated with the thinnings, the extensive harvest and the intensive harvest, at least the acres that would be subject to that in any over time on an annual basis. And the financial plan was developed by OSU that I think Tom did reference, that shows that the harvest associated with implementing the research design creates a financially self-supporting forest for the operation and management costs of the forest. So that's the answer. Agree, disagree, that's the answer to the question about whether there will be an infusion of money on an annual basis required to operate the forest. Paul Odenthal is here tonight from OSU, but I think that, and Katie Kavanaugh is here, and both have an extensive understanding of the modeling that was done. But that's the projections are that won't require.
I appreciate what you're saying, but notice that self-sustaining is a very frightening phrase when we're talking about a forest.
Yes, I understand that. I
And that we
understand.
understand, and we've got to do something more than just, for me, as a citizen, understand and do an awful lot more than understand. I think this is really, really crucial, and I think we're, anyway, I'll stop.
Troy, you might want to address the relationship of the HCP and the Elliott to the federal spotted owl issues.
Yep.
And if there's anything else to add, then that's great.
Yep, we'll do. I'll take both of those kind of final points, Barry, that you made. And I'll take maybe the last one on habitat first. Obviously, in these presentations that I give and the discussions we have in these meetings, they're pretty high level. In the HCP itself, we go into quite a lot of detail about habitat and what it is and where it is, including, relying on some sort of the most current and acceptable models of habitat and where it is on the forest. And so, I guess I would recommend just digging into that a little bit and see if that helps at all. And then the other thing, I guess your second question was about the 3.2 million acres. And so for the rest of the group, back in 2012, critical habitat was designated by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for northern spotted owls, and that includes habitat in California, Oregon, and Washington. In the, I'll just say, waning hours of the previous administration, previous federal administration, they vacated 3.2 million acres of that critical habitat, designated critical habitat. 3.5, yeah, sorry, of that designated critical habitat for northern spotted owl. Since then, since the Biden administration took office, they've been reconsidering that and it's currently been delayed a couple of times, but they're either going to reinstate that previous designation or redesignate something different. And that's being worked out right now. The way that intersects with the HCP, we do in the HCP discuss the potential for implementation of the research activities to impact designated critical habitat. We actually used the original 2012 designation as our, as the data that we were using because we were pretty confident that the vacation of the 3.5 million acres was going to be at least challenged, if not changed. So the sections in the HCP that deal with designated critical habitat and the perceived impact on acres to that deal with the 2012 designation of critical habitat. And then if the current administration makes any adjustments to that or changes or makes any final decisions about that before the HCP is final, we'll update the HCP accordingly. So anyway, that's the update on that. I think that answered all the questions. I don't know if Jeff, if there are others that I missed.
I think that's it for now. We can come back around if we've missed it. I want to make sure we include some of the others. I think Janet, you're up next, and then Anne Marie.
I have a couple of comments. In the OSU's research proposal, it says that non-fish bearing streams will have a minimum 50-foot buffer, but in the HCP, it doesn't look like non-perennial, just seasonal.
I can't hear.
You can't hear me?
No,
I can hear you.
you're coming across fine.
Oh, great. In the HCP, it doesn't look like seasonal non-fish bearing streams have any buffer zone.
His wife.
So that would be a discrepancy between the.
Yeah.
So Barry, I'm going to ask you I'm going to ask you to mute yourself again. I think we're picking up some background noise from your house. And Troy, you want to take this, and then Katie and Gordy are here to help as well.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks, Janet, for the question. So yeah, the intention in the HCP is for it to match exactly what the OSU proposal says. So we'll have to take a double check on that to make sure that we're not, saying something confusing there. The riparian conservation areas as described in the proposal have been just carried forward into the HCP. So thanks for raising that, and we'll take a double check. Yeah.
I think that's what it says. I'm not sure. Also, I just wanted to point out that marble murrelet surveys are often unsuccessful at detecting murrelets, even though we know they're there. So I feel like, there's been drone studies where they did, I think, infrared, and people were telling surveyors on the ground which direction the birds are going, and they still didn't see them. And so just surveying towards for probable absence, which is what is required, is not sufficient in, you know, finding them. So I hope that surveys will be more robust than that. But also, I just want to point out that in 1995, there were 69 northern spotted owls on the Elliott in 1995. And ODF, you know, burned through their take allotment of 43 in 15 years or something. But in that 1995 HCP, we were promised, the public was promised that there would be activity centers maintained for 26 northern spotted owls until 2055. So, you know, if that promise is being broken and we're only going to maintain 23, and if we happen to get a 24th owl, we might, you know, destroy, you know, we're only going to maintain 23 in this HCP. How can the public trust this HCP if we're not, you know, honoring commitments made in the 1995 Habitat Conservation Plan? So that's all I have to say. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Go ahead, Jeff, do you want to say something?
Yeah,
Or I can take
I
that.
appreciate the comment. I think that, and Katie, I'm going to ask you to weigh in a little bit on the modeled murrelet habitat and the premise for the model that was done to build on surveys and not just rely on them. I think that you know, that I guess the only response I can offer is that the management of the forest going forward is premised on supporting a research design, and everything that we're trying to build in the HCP and we will build in the legislation and in the forest management plan for the forest will be around the commitment of maintaining the research platform that's set forth in the OSU proposal, which depends upon certainty over a long stretch of time. And that's a pretty substantial difference in the underpinnings of management than was the case from 1995 or at any time prior for the Elliott as a common school fund asset, and when it was being managed to maximize revenue. And it was just a whole different premise of management. So it may not provide you with the level of comfort and certainty that you would like. And I understand that, and there's not much I can promise beyond the fact that what we're trying to accomplish here by decoupling it from the Common School Fund and establishing it as a research forest in legislation is in part meant to provide some of that certainty that was missing before, when revenue was playing a primary role in the management decisions. Katie, do you want to just quickly kind of talk a little bit about the modeling that was created by the researchers and how that plays into this?
Sure. Yeah, I can do that. Is it Janae? Is that how you say your name? So make sure.
It's Jeanette.
Jeanette. Okay, sorry. I just want to make sure I got it right. So Jeanette, your questions are all good. The 50-foot buffer on the non-fish bearing streams is part of the strategies. And also you have to realize that most of the areas that are on the forest are going to be reserves. So they're even the buffer concept. So it's actually much greater than most management, because as Jeff put it, the layer cake approach of having so many acres already in reserves and the reserves that are at the sub watershed level, as well as the very large 34,000 acre reserve, means that a large proportion of the non-fish bearing, as are the ephemeral streams that essentially get no protection under the current Forest Management Practices Act, will have very high levels of protection. So that's one thing to take into account when you think about the riparian protection. The second one about the modeling, we took the data on that from the forests that were, I shouldn't say we meaning the researchers that did the work, took the data that showed where the current marbled murrelet populations are deemed as occupied habitat. They took the characteristics of those data and they applied them to the entire forest to come up with what we call potential marbled murrelet habitat. And then that is included in our assessment. So It's not just to say, okay, we have this much of known occupied. The researchers are fully aware of your observation, that the detection probability is relatively low for a nest. So we've created a way to be able to try to add that extra layer of protection of what potential habitat is in the forest.
And you'll see that in the HCP, there are two specific designations, one being the designated occupied and the modeled potential occupied. And the protections are very specific for both, so that you can parse out those acres that have been modeled as potentially there based on characteristics. In part to try and get at the point you're making, which is a very legitimate one. It's under detection and surveys.
And
And
if I can just
I
add-
think there'll be some a fair amount of research also, interesting research on new detection methods going forward. And that's also part of the research plan.
That's what I was going to add really quickly, is that the commitment in HCP is to use, sort of like current scientifically accepted protocols for those surveys. And we know that's going to evolve. And that's actually part of the charge probably for this research force, is to evolve those methods to make them better. And so I think that is the idea over time here.
So I've got two more hands up. Anne-Marie, you're next. And then I think Maria from the Coast Range is following you. And then we'll, I think after that, open it up for any topic, knowing that there's pent up demand to talk about the governance issues.
Good evening. I am just really following the path of this conversation, which is not exactly what it is. I think what we have here is a structural problem. For the majority of Oregonians, the Elliott State Forest does not exist for research design purposes. Has nothing to do whatsoever with their research platform. Elliott is a living, breathing entity. It is a sovereign entity. Its animals are sovereign, and that is what we would like to have continue. The way these meetings are structured is we start over again and again and again. There's never any progress made. There are no real questions answered because we don't see the world in the same way. We don't see nature in the same way. Some of us have actually read the UN-backed report. Some of the authors of that report actually are professors at Oregon State University. I don't see their faces. I don't hear their voices. They've been included, as has the public. Anybody seeking to join this meeting would have to search long and hard if you weren't already a part of the process. On Oregon State University's site, I don't see any updates since April. I was struck last session by the large number of contradictions and the fact that not a single question that we've asked has actually been answered in a way that belongs to the same register. Again, Oregonians are interested in the Elliott as a living, breathing forest. If Oregon State University has not figured out buffers by now, given the fact that they own and manage multiple so-called research forests, or the ability to, quote, study marble murrelet response to management activities, and so forth and so on and so on, we're in really bad shape. What people who spoke before me, I agree with them wholeheartedly. We stand for a more humble approach to the world here at its end. We must fight against arrogance and people who believe that, quote unquote, beaver modeling and so forth and so on, with all due respect, is going to do anything. The Elliott has been here for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's really arrogant of human beings to think that they can figure this out while all the time talking about pulling out the herbicides. Last time, I think also we have a real problem here with There's so many questions, again, none of which have been answered during a process that's been going on for about 2 years now. I guess what the public wants to know, given what Mr. Harkima, with all due respect, said last time, is if we can actually engage in a political process with politics being defined a la Marshall McLuhan as a process of challenge, contest, and negotiation. What happened instead is a kind of structural disrespect in which public input, thanks for weighing in. No, I'm sorry, this simply won't do. And I guess before continuing in this process, since we do not want to be co-opted by proceduralism, we would have to be assured that politics as such, in the sense of challenge, contest, and negotiation, is even a possibility. We have to know that in stating the obvious, we will not be accused of disrespect. I'm so sorry. With all due respect, the entire structure of this public input, everything from actually people trying to find out when, where, and how the meetings will occur, to a kind of trivialization of public input. We simply cannot be drawn into numbers. Is it 50 feet or 55 feet? We simply must address the question of the Elliott itself as a living, breathing entity that resists being turned into a laboratory, a $35 million laboratory that will not benefit the Elliott State Forest whatsoever, as we just heard. There will be no promises kept, and marbled murrelets and northern spotted owls have been living in the Elliott for some time. Any disturbance of them is simply destructive. So we actually want to have a real conversation. We do not want to be accused of disrespect when we state obvious things. And we want the Elliott to be seen as what it is. It's not a platform for you doing research. And I have many questions, but that's a matter of structural respect. And it's a matter of respect for the earth.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate it, Emery. And I understand your perspective. And I think the structural disconnect here is that the political process with the land board being responsible for the ultimate management decisions around the Elliott started a process that directed this group that you've been observing for some time now to move forward with a research forest design and an HCP, and to come back with a plan to accomplish what it is that you're disagreeing with. And I understand the nature of the disagreement. I appreciate the perspective, but I think the structural disconnect is the decision on the pathway is one that we're not charged with making. We're charged with implementing and doing our best to do that. And I think that's what you're observing. Maria, I think you're up next.
Hi, thank you. And I want to thank Jeanette for her great comments and astute recommendations for both marble murrelet habitat and overall promises of the past. And I just want some clarification on some monitoring descriptions in the HCP, specifically with aquatic monitoring. I'm not really sure why there's a 3-year distribution amongst the different independent populations of coho, the 10 mile, the lower Umpqua, and the Coos. Why the year sampled is every 3 years. While I'm familiar with the life cycle of coho and their cohorts for every 3 years, I'm not sure why that would influence the years to be sampled for each population to be every 3 years. As well as, can someone who knows more about the aquatic monitoring, please give a little more detail of what kind of coho monitoring that's going to be happening? Are we talking juvenile? Are we just talking adult counting? And yeah, just a little bit more about like how we're going to actually be watching this population, because I feel like the fish, the coho specifically in the Elliott have incredible numbers and should be valued for their for what the Elliott should be valued as for what it is for coho, which is a lot of diverse habitat from the lake systems, as well as the value that the West Fork Millicoma has for the population, as well as just the fish that feed into the various estuaries along the coast, and that importance for our fisheries here as well. So yeah, a little more detail about that. And then I also just want to say that I strongly encourage us to all make better and keep pushing for improvements on the Pacific shorebirds, seabirds protocol for marble murrelet detection, and that improving that and encouraging that protocol to be enhanced is important, because the current protocol is lacking. So, but my question is about the coho monitoring.
So that's great, Maria. So I'm going to kick this to Gordy first, and then have you follow up, and you can address the Pacific Seabird Protocol relationship to the HCP when you do the follow-up. Gordy, you want to talk a little bit about the riparian monitoring rationale?
Yeah, I mean, that was a good question, and I think it's one that deserves more detail. First of all, what we're monitoring, and we propose to monitor, is habitat, not fish number. And we've done that for a couple of reasons. One is the Elliott has parts of the three independent populations. It doesn't have any major, but no major part of any one. So what happened on the Elliott is only a part of what happened to the entire independent population. And it'd be hard, if we were trying to deal with the population and their response, it'd be hard to partition out the Elliott from the other influences that it has. Secondly, is coho, and just coho in general, and with regard to freshwater, there's a whole suite of other factors that are going to affect population numbers. So for those two primary reasons, we focused on habitat. Now, what we were proposing to do is we will do complete censuses, a complete survey, and this is like counting every piece of wood, counting every pool, so on and so forth, of three systems on the Elliott, which is very different than what's been done traditionally, which is a subsample of small portions of watersheds, and then making some conjecture from there. So I think we'll have a much stronger ability to talk about habitat improvements as a result of the design we've opted for. The reason for the rotating panel, which is what you alluded to with the every 3 years, the rate of change of habitat is going to be relatively slow. It's not like we can, go out in 2 years and say that things have changed. It's very unlikely that'll happen. So what we're trying to do is to have this monitoring program have the best possible ability to track changes that occur over a long time period, over the life of the HCP. Jeff, I think you're muted.
Troy, go ahead and do the follow-up. And Maria, I think you might have a follow-up question if you want. Troy, you want to add on and address the protocol?
Yeah, so just switching over there into the marble murrelet protocol, the Pacific Seabird Protocol, which you alluded to, Maria. So acknowledging that is currently changing, being reviewed and being updated. the information or I guess the language that you'll see in the HCP is an acknowledgement of the existing protocol, and then also acknowledging that as that changes, and that was sort of what I was saying a minute ago about whatever the, currently scientifically supported protocol is, that might be the next version of the Pacific Seabird Protocol, or whatever happens after that is the protocol that will be used. So understand that there are problems with the old or existing protocol, and that's being updated. And we're kind of midstream on that as we are putting this together. So we try to acknowledge both. And the idea is that we'll be using the best of, whatever the scientific community supports going forward.
Maria, did you have a follow-up on the riparian before we move on? And Francis, I think you're up next with your governance questions.
Yeah, I guess I would just like to say that I feel like only monitoring habitat miss is a crucial component of the information that we could get out of the Elliott, especially with coho numbers. And I'd like to see more effort towards monitoring population counts and helping the efforts that are already going on in Coos Bay for both in-stream habitat creation between all the groups that already work here and do that, as well as acknowledging and helping to amplify the current population monitoring that goes on here between ODF, W, and others in the area. There's a lot of information that I think would be missing if we don't actually try to understand the life cycle of the fish themselves and the population estimates that we could possibly get.
Well, I totally agree, and I think the plan, we've talked with ODFW and others about how we can complement their efforts. And the other part of this is that there will likely be a very strong research component that will look into particularly the life history cycles of the coho on the Elliott, and not only the life history cycles on the Elliott, but how how fish on the Elliott may be contributing to downstream segments of these independent populations. So there's a monitoring component, and then there'll be a complementary research component that will greatly expand. I expect it's greatly going to expand our knowledge and understanding about how these fish use the landscape, which will be invaluable for.
Yeah, and it's so variable across the Elliott with the lakes and the estuaries and the rivers. So yeah, that's helpful.
Yeah, and I believe there's a Watershed Council planning session on the riparian strategy in 2 weeks. Maybe it's even next week. There's been some discussion, but we're working hard to make sure that we're represented there at the invitation of the council, so we can begin to integrate the thinking a little bit more. So we may see you there. Francis,
Jeff,
oh, go ahead, Troy.
Sorry about that. Can I just add on real quick? I also wanted to just note, I think the discussion about monitoring in aquatics is a good one, and also the discussions about murrelets. And I wanted to just sort of point out an overarching theme, which is that the HCP has a sort of very specific purpose, and it's related to permitting under the Endangered Species Act. And there are things in there that we've been working with the federal agencies to integrate strategies and objectives, et cetera, that can be used for that specific process. It doesn't eliminate the ability, and again, this is going to be a research force, so it doesn't eliminate the ability to do other work on fish related to research, or murrelets related to research that maybe it wouldn't be required by the HCP. But no less will likely happen. And I'll point out, just in response to Francis, one of your comments in the comment list, I think coastal martins fall into that category as well. So coastal martin is not a covered species under the HCP. The main reason for that is there is such limited information on martin in the Elliott that through the permitting process, it's actually quite difficult for us to get it included in the permit because there's just a lack of information. So once a research program picks up and research on coastal martin in the Elliott is underway, there probably will become at some point enough information to include it in an amendment in the future. And I think that's a really good example where, that research will have to occur. I imagine that as part of it, collared females, or female martins will be collared. Den sites will need to be protected as part of take avoidance. That'll all be happening outside of the HCP, but it doesn't mean that it won't be happening. And so I do want to point that out that, the HCP is sort of a very specific permitting vehicle, and the research itself will very likely, accomplish, I think, a lot of the things that we're talking about here tonight. So that's just my perspective on it.
Francis?
I think Peggy was next with her governance question. No?
Well, I skipped Peggy because she already had a shot, so I thought I'd give you the next
Okay.
up, and then we'll go back to her. Thanks.
thank
though.
Well, thanks for addressing some of the coastal martin question, Troy. So where will the survey protocols be laid out? Are you going to survey for martins before every single timber sale? And what kind of surveys are you going to do, and how much will this cost? Is that already in your budget?
Yeah, thanks. So that won't be addressed in the HCP, but that's the kind of thing that will be addressed in the forest management planning process. So, and not just marten, but for all other species in general, I'll just say. I can't speak to the budgeting on that necessarily, but I know that the details of that are about to start coming together, generally on the forest management plan. So probably there'll be more information available on all of that, at some point in the future. But going back to what I said a minute ago, we did look hard at whether to include coastal marten as a covered species in the HCP, both with our project team and also working closely with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and ODF&W, decided not to include it for the reasons I described, knowing that we're probably going to learn a lot more about marten and how it's using the forest under the research program going forward. So more to come on the surveys required to demonstrate take avoidance and the cost of that, I think, in the future.
So we have to wait for the forest management plan to see what the survey protocol is for coastal marten. We won't know before that time.
That's correct. It's not included in the HCP. Yep.
And when can we expect the first draft of the forest management plan?
Katie?
Francis, hi. Well, first of all, I can't promise the FMP will have the details on the protocols that you're looking for because we haven't looked at it closely yet. So I don't want to give you a false impression that it will be there when I'm not certain exactly what level of detail will be there. There will be some information on other species of concern and set out the criteria and how we're going to deal with them. But I can't say specifically, what level of detail will be there. And because again, one is we don't have someone that's well versed yet that's been speaking to that issue. And so I want to be careful about that. So just that. And as far as the first draft of the forest management plan, I think it's at least, well, it's a process. And we actually have some steps and stages that we've been discussing in terms of what that process is. And the first step of the process is to start gathering some more data and information. And then as well as, putting that into a kind of a landscape context and then kind of figuring out exactly how the layout and the allocation will play out. And that those steps and those stages are outlined in some materials that we can share if you want them. And also we have, we've outlined, we're also on a little different journey than a typical forest management plan because it is a forest management plan for a research forest, which is very different than a forest management plan for a solely commodity-based forest that has very different objectives. So I just wanted to keep those things in mind too as we go forward thinking about it. But we're going to have output coming out of our forest management plan probably within the next 6 months, but it'll just be early preliminary data and thinkings like that. So
So the first draft of the forest management plan might be 6 months down the road there.
No, I would not expect a first draft of the forest management plan for a year, at least, and
A
if
year.
not longer. But because there's a process that's going to take to get to the point where we're comfortable with making decisions, and we have the information and the data that we need to make the decisions. So as a research forest, it's very different in terms of our objectives, and one of our objectives is research. And we don't have all the research projects designed yet. We have a template, we have a backbone, but we don't have all the projects designed, and that's a big part of going into the forest management plan.
Okay, and I assume that the public will have a public comment period for the forest management plan when a draft does come out, right?
Yes, and we actually hope to have public engagement and input at several stages along the way before the draft comes out. We hope to be able to share information as we learn more about the Elliott that's going to help us make decisions. And so we hope to have several points of contact with the public before a draft comes
Okay.
out.
Did I hear
Thank
that
you very
right?
much. And I just have
There won't be a
quick
plan for another
comment.
year? Did you say?
No, wait a minute, Barry, just a second, let me finish.
You're on mute,
Francis,
Francis.
you're muted.
Oh, okay. Just another really quick comment about the coastal martin survey protocols. I understood you to say that they might not be in the forest management plan. And so if the public was interested in monitoring your implementation of those martin survey protocols, how would we do that? If they aren't going to be in the forest management plan, they'll be somewhere else, right?
No, that's not what I said exactly. I said, I don't know what level of detail will be in there. I don't know if it will say we're going to do X on this day, or we're going to collar 5, or we're going, that's a level of detail I don't think will be in there. There will be the detail on how we will address and protect coastal martin and other species of concern throughout the implementation of the research project. Okay. So
Okay, but so far, yes, but the coastal martin is the only other species that's listed under the ESA that is not included in the HCP. So it's got a special designation there, hopefully, to be protected.
Yes, but I don't have any idea how many coastal martin there are in the forest. I don't have any idea of, what all the recommendations are for their level of protection. So that's why I'm trying to be careful.
The other
Okay,
thing I
thank
might,
you.
Francis, the other thing I might add on coastal martin, because it is listed under the SA, is when the HCP undergoes NEPA review, that NEPA review considers not just the treatment of the covered species, but all species, including other, listed species or those that are of special concern. So it might be that there is some information that comes out of the NEPA review process that dictates, what happens in the future with coastal martin as well. So that's something else that just, to keep your eyes on as that NEPA process plays out over the next year.
Okay, thank you. It's currently not mentioned in the existing draft of the HCP. Coastal martins is not mentioned in there at all.
Correct.
That's correct. Yeah. And it's simply because that is not a covered it is not a covered species in the HCP, which means we just are silent on it. I know that doesn't seem like the right thing to do, but that's how they're put together. So.
Okay, thank you.
Peggy, you've been waiting patiently. I passed you by.
Oh, that was fine. We needed to get the creatures questions done. I want to move on to governance kinds of things. So I have three issues around governance that I'm still trying to understand. The first one that no one has answered yet is that I understand that the Common School Fund is still owed $120 million unless you're going to do another appraisal, in which case I don't know what that new number would be. So can you first explain that one? And then I do have a couple of more.
Sure. So Bill, I think this is a good one for the deputy director to grab hold of.
Sure, and just make sure I unmute myself. Good evening, everybody. Peggy, yeah, so really good point. And yes, the Common School Fund needs, for full decoupling, at least at this point, would need $121 million. We actually will be doing a new appraisal, revisiting the appraisal to make sure that we get a current number. We have not actually started that process yet. It's a several month process to get an appraisal, and we don't want to trigger that until we have a better sense of the timing of when we'll know. We need to know exactly the number to decouple, and we don't want that new appraisal to get stale. The old appraisal, I believe, was from 2017, so it's several years old and definitely needs to be revisited. So there will be a new appraisal of the current value of the forest.
And what's the plan for whatever the money is? Where is the money coming from?
Wherever it can is the answer. So I can tell you that the land board and the treasurer's office in particular is really kind of shaking the trees, looking for funding sources, but we're looking for a mix of federal, state, and funds from other non-public sources as well. Nothing is locked in yet, so still on the hunt and putting together a package for decoupling.
So I bring this up simply because I want everybody to understand that the Elliott is still owned by the Common School Fund. And that's part of why we're having this whole conversation, is how to deal with that. So the next thing I want to follow up on is OSU presented last time that they need about $17 million for infrastructure. Is that going to be a bonding request for 2022? And then they said that they need $10 million for 3 years of operating dollars. However, we know that the legislature only funds operating things every 2 years. And if it were in 2022, it would simply be 1 year with a no guarantee that they'll get another 2 years of that part of the operating money. So what's the plan for that amount of it? And then I have one more after that.
Well, I can tell you, Peggy, that that we're well aware of the issues with the funding and are still working on solutions for that. We don't have a hard plan for that at this point.
Nor do we have a fixed date for a transfer of the forest out of the Common School Fund and the beginning of the management.
Okay, so you don't plan at this point to ask for this money in the 2022 legislative session?
It's not a plan that I'm aware of.
Okay, that's
and part of the reason here, Peggy, is that one of the predicates for transferring the forest out of the Common School Fund is the completion of the HCP. So some of this is tying this together on an arc of time that will create a transfer date in the future that'll be tied to a couple of different components: the HCP, the decoupling, and some of the startup costs that have been estimated.
So then that brings me to the last question, and that's around at the last advisory committee meeting and the one before, there was a discussion about a public corporation or doing something sort of like the South Slough, and all of this seemed to be that it was going to be moving forward in 2022. And your answer just a minute ago was really right on. I can't see how we can do much movement until OSU knows what the HCP is going to be and what they know, what, if anything, they can harvest and how much they can harvest and all of that. So where are we with that public corporation idea? And is it going to show up in 2022?
Bill, you want me to take a crack first?
Sure.
So the public corporation was a placeholder for really what we mean as an independent public body that can be put in place via legislation, which we've been contemplating all along, needing legislation to accomplish the ultimate goal. That piece of legislation we are going to move forward with in 2022 session. It may or may not have a funding component associated with it. I agree with Bill. We just don't know at this moment. We're beginning to form the legislative concept as we talked about at the session, at the the last advisory committee meeting. That piece of legislation can put the framework in place for what the expectation would be for management and governance of the forest in the future, but at a date in the future contingent upon the completion of things. So it's not a necessary assumption that with the legislation, the transfer has to occur at a specific point in time. And there are some thoughts being given to how to construct the legislation so that it'll create the certainty of what the governance structure will look like at the time the forest is transferred, after the predicates for transferring it have been accomplished.
Well, for those of us who are following all of this, that legislation, I believe, has to be done by the middle of November. This is almost the 1st of October. That's not a long time for the public to be able to consider whatever it is that you're going to propose. So I just want to put a real concern out there that we are not sure that we are willing to support any legislation in 2022 unless we have better understanding of what it really is, because it has always been our belief that the Elliott needs to be in public hands, and we have to make sure that those public hands are truly public hands. So thank you for everything. I'll listen now.
No, I think we all agree with you, and I can see Bill and Paul both nodding as you're talking. And we are setting up a process that will have stepwise having opportunities to talk through the development of the legislative concept, so that will not, I promise you, have a legislative concept that is a bill that is dropped that has not been previewed section by section in meetings like this. And I think by next week, you'll see that we'll have a schedule laid out for question and answer sessions just like this, but specifically dedicated to the legislation and the development of the legislative concept. We've established a working group out of the advisory committee, that's the subcommittee that's going to start the work on the legislative concept, and we'll be noticing their meetings, and their meetings will be open to the public along the way. So I couldn't agree with you more. It's a sure recipe for disaster to surprise people on February about what a piece of legislation is that's going to go through the 2022 session.
Thank you.
Before I go back to repeats here, just checking on anybody else that hasn't had an opportunity to ask questions. Okay, go back. Anne Marie, do you have a question? Oh, I'm sorry, David, you're waving your hand. You're gonna have to take yourself off mute. And then Anne Marie will come back to you. You're still there, David, still on mute. It's down, should be down in the lower left corner of your screen.
There we go. I found it.
There you
Hear
go.
me now?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah, my biggest concern, my family's been the fire in the Elliott Forest forever. You people are missing the 1879 fire. I have documented that and so forth, and my family has been with the holiday fire over there. So we know fire history, and the Elliott Forest has fire history. My concern and my school district's concern in North Bend is the fire danger. And that's one thing we'd like to get something addressed on, for one thing. That's one topic. The other topic is the spine gravel in the river. And after the double meander forest sale, they had a landslide that went into the river, and it blocked the river, West Fork, and they come in and did some work and all that. They put a lot of fish habitat stuff and everything in the river, weirs and boulders. We hauled boulders, and all that gravel is going down the river through this cycle. And I think they ought to address that in some of their research. They could use that for something to research. And you people aren't learning. I'd be for fish habitat. So that's the two topics of concern I have, and I'd just like you to look at that. Thank you.
Katie, any comments on the fire piece? And I see Gordy's put himself back in the picture. Perhaps he wants to talk about the landslide or the research potential on the gravel movement.
Yeah, the fire piece, I think, is a big part of our interest, and both the fire history as well as what the future portends for fire on the Elliott and the rest of the Coast Range. So as you know, the Elliott is kind of at that south end of that Coast Range climate, where before it dumps, kind of transitions farther south, which is much more dry and fire prone, and so and as a little bit southeast as well. So what is the future of the Elliott in terms of future fire conditions and weather, as well as what it has been in the past? So both those things are really strong interests of us. So looking at the data that your family has, the data that is spelled out in the tree rings, the data that the forest is going to provide us, and as we listen to what the forest is telling us, are all big parts of what we want to study on the Elliott. So thank you for your contribution, David. I'll let Gordy talk about the fish.
Can you still hear me?
Yep.
Well, my family history starts with they arrived 6 or 7 years after the fire of 1879, and it was nothing but they ran cattle on it, clear out up into the Schofield headwaters of Dean Mountain, and over it's about 35,000 acres of that forest was designated. It was actually farmland. That's what they were using it for. And now you have a forest. So you have a lot of research if you look at the history and what you're trying to do, and that's something that needs to be addressed and all this stuff going forward. I'm not against what you're doing. I just disagree, actually.
Yeah, I've looked at the photos too, that of your family place, and looked at those hillsides and those hill slopes, and that's been really interesting from a couple perspectives. And I'm really curious, what some of the things that have happened to all the snags that were left over from those fires, and as another really interesting piece of research.
Well, I'd like to meet with you and I could talk about some of that stuff, but I've got quite a knowledge of it.
Good.
And,
Well, I appreciate you.
We could do that.
I appreciate you
Thank
chiming
you.
in. And I'll let Gordy speak on the fish habitat.
Yeah, I think you'll be pleasantly surprised that, or maybe not surprised, that the issue of landslides and fish is going to be front and center with the research on the Elliott.
That's where you get your spawning gravel.
It's part of spawning gravel and looking at the ecological role of landslide in contributing both gravel and wood.
All the spawning gravel is coming out of the slides because of any gravel that's in the river, it grinds up to sand, and that's why there's no gravel unless you have slides.
That you're absolutely
all ends up out in the bay, and they dredge it out.
Yep.
After the big fires, that's when they got a lot of sediment in the rivers and stuff in the bay. That's when a lot of the bay actually filled in out there after the fire of 1879. And I have documented that. It's in the history, and I see even in your Oregon State history too. I got the surveys from I can't remember the names, and then one of my relatives did the surveys, and then Herman Larson had that documented perfectly. He was 1 year old in 1868 at Larson Inlet, and in 1879 they moved back in after the second fire. And that fire burnt all the Elliott forest, and you have here in your numbers is 1868. You might want to reconsider that figure. That's really all I have to say. Thank you.
Thanks, David. I've gotten a couple of comments in the chat box. For those of you that might not be as frequent on Zoom as some of the rest of us, if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a reactions tab. And if you click on that, you'll see a place to be able to raise hand electronically. And Angus, Anne Marie, I'm going to hold you for a minute because Angus did not see that tab and is asked to have a chance to put his question on the table. Angus?
Thank you. Appreciate that. So yeah, I have another governance question. So I know you mentioned the legislative concept is still in the very, very early stages of development, but I'm curious what specifics you can offer at this point as to the structure of the public corporation. Just things like how many directors there will be on the board, and you know, especially who is ultimately going to be accountable when it comes to whether or not the mission as stated in the legislation is being fulfilled. Is that on the board of directors? Is it on the management team? And what does accountability look like between those two bodies?
It's a great question, and you're putting your finger on a key issue. So I don't have the slides tonight, but if you look at the tape or the recording that's posted on the DSL website of the meeting last week, September 22nd, there was a slide deck that showed potential sections of legislation that would address the different governance issues that would most likely need to be addressed in an Elliott State Research Forest bill. We don't have a predetermined governance board composition or structure. So what I can tell you today is that there was a lot of work done earlier on in the process between OSU and a group of members subcommittee of the Stakeholder Advisory Committee. And I think that they did start talking about an advisory board structure. And I think about as much as we know right now is that if there's an independent public body, and it might not be a public corporation, and it doesn't have to be a public corporation, it just so long as it's an independent public entity, there will be an advisory committee structure, and there will be a board of directors structure, with the board of directors being responsible for the oversight of the forest. But the composition of those two entities or boards has not been covered yet in any of the legislative concept development, but it will be in the coming weeks. And we will have a very public forum for us to go through that with meetings like this multiple times over the next month of October and early November. Troy, I think there's while Anne Marie's asking her question, I think there's a question in the chat box around HCP cost assumptions, and also one around monitoring, that maybe inventory and monitoring AIM questions on frequency that maybe you could take a look at while Anne Marie's asking her question.
Yeah, thanks. I did just answer, I think, Joni's question about the costs of monitoring.
Oh, okay, great.
And for those who are following the chat, I am trying to keep up. I'll go back and look and see if I missed any and if there's anything I can add there.
Yeah,
Thanks.
Can't guarantee we're going to get to what's in the chat box. So if it's a real key issue for you, raise your hand. Anne Marie. Question.
Yeah, a statement first. I'm a little befuddled here, listening to Ms. Lynch and also Mr. Gold. I would like to hear more from them. I'm befuddled by the concern of Ms. Lynch, given her what she does in the world and the Common School Fund, et cetera, and her long time commitment to that, and the general lack of concern about this by other people. That's kind of odd to people who are not in your group. And I really would like to hear more also from Mr. Gold, given his families. I wonder whether anybody here from the Oregon Department of State Lands or Oregon State University or the Elliott State Forest Advisory Committee knows the documents to which Mr. Gold referred in his comments.
I think we do. I was sitting here trying to remember the name of the book. It's Cheese Sandwiches and
Pork boots, cheese sandwiches,
Cork boots and cheese sandwiches. And how long is it?
425 pages or something.
I can't
David
attest that
had
I've,
some comments here on, but we also have an oral history that is at OSU that's based on some of Dave's findings. Bob Zyback has done a wonderful job of doing that, and we're very aware of what Bob has done. So, Anne Marie, we're very knowledgeable. I mean, we're not, obviously, we don't know nearly as much as David knows, and but we do try as much as we can when information comes forward to utilize it. So,
Just to follow up on the same.
you had a
kind-
question. Yes.
Yes, I have a question, and a question also entails follow-up from you all at answering the questions. It's not a one-way. These questions are often treated as rhetorical. They're actually not rhetorical. So does anyone, the OSU or DSL or the advisory committee, have you read about the biotelemetry of collared birds? Because that's also quite shocking and indicates that perhaps you're not aware of the research that's already been conducted in this respect. So I don't really think it's enough to simply state that you're knowledgeable. It's not a matter of knowledge, as we've said over and over again. It's a matter of devotion to the earth and courage. So does anybody, it's a real question. I would like to have it answered.
what are you talking about with the telemetry of?
Somebody suggested that birds were going to be collared in the Elliott. So we don't need further research, because all you have to do is look and see that the research is out there. We don't need to destroy any other birds or negatively affect their behavior, because the research already exists.
Well,
you know of this research? My question is so simple.
Anne Marie, I think that Katie's tried a couple times to break in, so I'm going to let Katie finish off, and then we're going to keep moving. I'm not trying to shut you down, but I'm trying to make opportunities.
All due respect, you actually are.
No, actually, Anne Marie, I'm sorry. That there is a lot of things we do not know and we do not understand. Mm-hmm. And we're dealing with a system that's very complex, which I'm sure you're very aware of. And I think you feel it in the way you feel about the forest and the way you express yourselves about the forest. That is a big part of forestry, and it's a big part of many of us, the way we feel about forests. We also want to understand what we can about forests so that we don't make some of the same mistakes we've made in the past. And we don't know a lot about particularly marbled murrelets, right? They're a very elusive bird, as everyone can tell you, and we're trying to get to understand. One of the things we recently found out was that the effect that ocean conditions have on populations. And so if you go to count the birds when the ocean conditions are bad, you're going to find you're not going to find occupancy. And so only by really understanding them do we know now that a lot of their ups and downs in populations are related to the ocean conditions, and that we need to provide habitat suitable during the good years so that there's enough potential habitat for the birds. And that's an important finding, and it's not something we knew 2 years ago or 3 years ago. So I can't tell you enough that we feel really passionately about the need for research, and probably we're biased because we're researchers, but I don't think we have enough answers. And we're going to continue to manage forests, whether we like it or not. Managing forests and wood products are a big part of what we all deal with in our society. So I really think you have to take that into account as well, that it's not a single entity in the way we look at things and we manage them, that there's multiple ways of thinking and looking at things.
Of course, I really appreciate that, but my question's still not answered. We already have a huge amount of research done on telemetry of collared birds. Perhaps Mr. Salinger knows something about this, or someone else. We already know We already have a very large amount of research on what happens once you even cut a road through a living forest. We already have a huge amount of research on any number of things. The redundancy is kind of startling. And I wonder how many research forests OSU already owns and or manages. And for how long have they owned or managed these forests?
So Katie, I'm going to ask you to answer that question on the number of forests and that the college has for research. And then Troy, if you'll pull in around Joni's questions that on the chat board.
We have 2 forests that are called research forests that are actually managed for teaching, research, and extension. That are 2 major ones. We have probably another 7 or 8 smaller forests that are scattered around that are primarily demonstration forests. And so that's the level that we have. We have the Blodgett Forest up on the north coast, and we have the McDonald Dunn, which sits kind of as the backdrop of Corvallis. So
a total of 10 research forests.
Roughly, don't quote me on that one, but it's because some of them are only 25 acres, and they're small. They're lands that were left to the school for different purposes. So.
And while the college doesn't own it, the college is actively engaged in setting the research agenda on the H.J. Andrews Forest.
Yes, yeah, the H.J. Long-Term Ecological Research Site, which is up the Mackenzie River, is also something where a lot of the research and our understanding of long-term complex ecological functions in forests are a big part of the research up there. And so if you haven't explored the H.J. Andrews, I highly recommend it, and to look at some of the benefits of doing long-term research. A lot of what we know, and you're right, we do know a lot, Anne Marie. We don't know it all, and we don't pretend we know it all, but we do know a lot. And a lot of that knowledge has come off the H.J. Andrews.
So you've done research on, for instance, what it means to cut a road through a living forest for the species.
They did research on clear cutting watersheds. They've been monitoring the water quality on those watersheds since 1952. They've done research they have research projects on what happens to a log when it falls down, that are 1,000-year-long research projects planned. So we better understand the life of a down piece of wood after it hits the ground, and that decomposition rate, and what colonizes it, and what organisms rely on that. We've done research on northern spotted owls at the H.J. Andrews. We know where every northern spotted owl nest is. We know where what the fate is of those birds. And there's been no logging on the H.J. Andrews probably since the 1970s. And so we have a huge record of what effects are in the presence of a disturbance like logging, and then also afterwards, and what are the long-term processes of recovery and change over time, and what are the natural disturbance agents. I could go on, but I really recommend you look at the H.J. Andrews website if you haven't looked at it yet.
So
we have 12 minutes left.
Question is, why do you need another research forest if you already have this information and data? That
research forest was done in the context of that time and that date when that forest was established. A forest isn't a cookie cutter. Every forest is different. Every process is different in those forests, and we don't treat them like cookie cutters. What we learn in one place doesn't always inform us what we find in another place. And the Coast Range of Oregon really needs a major research forest. We truly believe that. And so I hope that this happens, and we're hoping that it works out. And if it does, we think it's going to make a major contribution to forestry globally, and we think it's an important endeavor. So
I'm going to end this part of the conversation here. We have about 11 minutes left. Troy, you may have a couple of adds to some of what's in the chat, and
actually, Gordy had his hand up, I think. Or did you want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in real quick. No research forest has an advent fish on it. None of the OSU ones. So this is going to be a really unique opportunity and one that's going to be invaluable for the people of Oregon.
And then, Jeff, I think I have addressed most of the questions in the chat. I apologize if I missed one, but there were some questions about monitoring. Joni had some questions about monitoring and the considerations for the cost of monitoring and whether or not citizen science could be part of the overall monitoring program. Within the HCP, there is a monitoring program, as we've been talking about a little bit. It's described in Chapter 6 of the HCP. The costs that you see in the HCP in Chapter 8 include the monitoring costs for the HCP. Those monitoring costs are specific to compliance and effectiveness of the HCP itself and the conservation strategy itself. And so they are tailored to just the 3 covered species that are addressed in the HCP, but all that is in there and is considered. As far as the role of citizen science, I mean, I think that's something that'll be kind of more figured out as the forest management planning process unfolds, but no doubt there will be, I think, probably opportunities for, all sorts of partnerships in the future to address the research questions and the monitoring questions that are going to happen on the forest. So if I missed or didn't fully answer questions from folks in the chat, certainly we can do that now, or we could always do it as a follow-up email exchange or whatever via probably Jeff or whoever the right contact is.
Yeah. So we have one more of these meetings next week. And if there's more information that you would like in advance, you're certainly welcome to reach out. My email address is on the website. If you did miss the governance conversation at the September 22nd meeting, I encourage you to go to the website, and if you pull up the PowerPoint presentation portions that are posted there, you'll see a presentation on the governance structure and the development of legislative concept and anticipated coverage of a concept. Troy's HCP and my presentations on the aggregation of the protection provisions is also posted there. It's recorded as this meeting has been. And if you are looking through the HCP administrative draft and find inconsistencies, as Jeanette mentioned earlier, we really would love to hear from you directly. And so please reach out in whatever way it's easiest. I know Bob Salinger did some of that last week, and it was really helpful as we were putting the final touches on things that we did post. So we're not done looking for that kind of feedback, please. Anybody that has not felt like they've had an opportunity to weigh in on something either on the chat board or in person tonight, I want to give you the last shot here. And if not, Anne Marie, I think I'd be happy to continue the conversation, maybe in a smaller group, but we can begin to let people go on to their evening that would like to do that. And I would stay till 7:30 to talk more if you need to have another question addressed. I'm sensitive because we got a lot of people that I am looking at on the screen that I know were in the office at 8 o'clock this morning and still haven't had dinner. So I want to make sure that they get a chance to move on.
I don't know if you see Jeff, Darrell has his hand up.
No, I didn't see that. Daryl, wherever you are on my screen, I'm not seeing you. So please, there you are. Why don't you unmute? There you go.
Daryl Whipple, Willapa Hills Audubon Society. We're a bi-state chapter. I would like the research topics going to be addressed have to do with carbon emissions from forestry. And as I understand, a large portion of Oregon's climate emissions are from forestry activities. So it seems appropriate that a research forest, especially if it's going to include sample forestry operations, that the main emphasis ought to be in reducing carbon emissions where possible, if not restricting them considerably. And that looks to me like a considerable challenge for the forestry industry.
Thanks, Daryl. You know, the governor asked specifically that OSU work on developing and articulating the connection of research to the carbon questions that are pending and so important. And so I know that there's been a fair amount of discussion at the university around that. Katie, do you want to talk a little bit about the role of carbon research in the platform implementation of the platform that's designed?
Yes, I'm happy to talk about that. Somebody who's studied lots of different processes about carbon and carbon sequestration and uptake in forests. For most of her career, these forests in particular are a tremendous sink for carbon globally. And they're a tremendous sink because of the incredible productivity that's inherent in the climate that they grow in. There's probably very few places that the density of the trees are as high as they are, the height of the trees are as high as they are. And as you know, from being from the Willapa Bay area, it's a similar situation up there. And one of the key parts of that is what are the rates of growth and decomposition, and how do they balance under different management scenarios. And so some of the work you're talking about now is Bev Law's work, who's a member of our faculty who's recently retired, is based on a model called CLM. And that model has predicted that if you have longer rotations, you sequester more wood than if you have shorter rotations. So a lot of the emission part that's predicted from that model is based on rotation length. So we think that getting some actual measurements of some of the carbon pools and fluxes in forests over time to either better parameterize the models, or as well as better understand what the balance is in carbon uptake and fluxes. And that includes the entire system of the wood from the time it's a seed germinated to the time it goes into somebody's house and becomes a piece of plywood that gets discarded when they re-roof their house. So understanding that full system is a really important part of the work that we're doing as well. And not just looking at the forest system or the built environment, but understanding the connections between the two. So it's a big part of what we want to do. And I appreciate your question.
You better do it fast, because we don't have very many years left, and I find the meeting starting just now. This is really an absurdity to me to think about talking about carbon and thinking about slicing down any one more of those trees. What are we doing? What are we doing, people? Can we think of this? And Jeff, I have to ask you this question, clarification. What are we going to see legislation in January or February without a final FMP or HCP? Is that the case?
The legislation is going to address the governance structure for the forest.
Only the governance structure.
And
is that right?
And yes, I believe so.
I think that's.
I don't have the legislation mapped out, but it's.
Okay, I want to say as a citizen, I find it close to dishonest. We're going to be voting on something that is about governance, not about the life of this forest, and not about anything about money. And I think that is absurd. When you hear it out loud, please, you have to see that there is some absurdity about this. Agree to this. This is that does not sit well, and it will not sit well.
Understood. Sue, we haven't heard from you tonight, so I'll give you the last minute of the meeting, and go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted to ask, what is it you're developing? The public for the governance? What is it called?
the legislation is intended to set out a structure for the way the forest will be the governed or decision-making structure for the forest
And what
in the
would it be
future.
called?
Pardon?
What is it called?
It'll be some sort of public entity.
Public.
It hasn't been decided exactly what the form of that will be, and the legislative concept will develop around creating the form of decision-making structure should the forest go forward and be decoupled from the Common School Fund.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Okay, folks, it's 7:30. So unfortunately, yes, the meeting is just getting started with a lot of new questions and areas to talk about. You've all kind of informally met tonight. So if there's some cross conversations between folks that had interesting things to say, I encourage you to continue it. And we will pick up again next week. And thank you for spending your evening with us. Take care.